I paid off my daughter's wedding debt when her fiancé's family backed out of covering the reception. I never once brought it up again. Then, at her housewarming party, my son-in-law's mother introduced herself to my own grandchildren as the only grandmother that matters. I remember the morning my daughter called me about the venue deposit. Her voice was shaking, but not with excitement. It was panic. The daughter, Grace, my only child, had been planning her wedding for 8 months, and 3 weeks before the big day, her fiancé's parents pulled their promised contribution. Some falling out over politics at a family dinner, something petty and stupid that grown adults should have been able to set aside. But they didn't set it aside. They let their pride cost my daughter her wedding. I had just sold my hardware store after 31 years behind the counter. My wife, Diane, had passed 6 years earlier, breast cancer, and the store had been the only thing keeping me upright after that. Getting up at 5, opening at 7, knowing every regular customer's name and their kids' names too. When I finally sold it, I told myself the money was for whatever came next. I didn't know what came next would be my daughter, crying on the phone, asking me if I thought the wedding should be canceled. I didn't hesitate. I told her to send me the numbers. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the band. It came to just under $40,000. I wrote the check that week. I didn't want a plaque. I didn't want a toast. I didn't want anyone at that wedding to know where the money came from. I just wanted my little girl to walk down the aisle without carrying that weight on her shoulders. Grace married Thomas on a Saturday in October, under a sky so blue it looked painted. I walked her down the aisle myself, since her mother wasn't there to do it with me. I gave a short toast at the reception, something simple about how proud I was, how her mother would have been prouder still. I didn't mention the money, but not one word. That was never the point. And Thomas seemed like a good man. Quiet, hardworking, an engineer at a firm downtown. His parents, Richard and Constance, were pleasant enough at the wedding, distant but polite, the kind of people who shake your hand a little too firmly to prove something. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured every family has its own temperature, and theirs just ran a little cooler than mine. The years after the wedding moved the way years do when you're getting older. Quick, and then suddenly not quick at all. Grace and Thomas had 2 children. A boy named Caleb, and a girl named Millie. I saw them when I could. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional Sunday dinner. But I started to notice, the way you notice a draft in a house before you find where it's coming from, that Constance was always there too. Always centered. Always the one holding the baby first, the one whose name the kids said first, the one who got the good chair. I told myself it didn't matter. Grandchildren have room in their hearts for more than one grandmother. I wasn't in competition with anybody. I just wanted to be part of their lives, the way any grandfather wants to be part of his grandchildren's lives. But there was something underneath Constance's warmth toward the kids that felt, to me, less like love and more like ownership, like she was staking a claim. Grace and Thomas bought a house 2 years ago, out in a newer development with wide streets and matching mailboxes. I helped them with the down payment too, quietly, the same way I'd helped with the wedding. $15,000 wired straight to escrow, no fanfare. Grace tried to argue with me about it. She said Thomas felt uncomfortable taking more from me. I told her that was exactly why I wasn't going to make it a discussion. A father helps his daughter. That's not a loan. That's not a transaction. That's just what a father does. They finally finished decorating the house this spring, and Grace called to invite me to a housewarming. She sounded excited on the phone, the way she used to sound as a little girl before a birthday party. She said they wanted to introduce the house properly, family first, then friends and neighbors later in the afternoon. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. I spent the week before the party the way I imagine most grandfathers do. I went to the store and bought a gift, a hand-painted ceramic house number plaque with their address on it, custom-made by a woman 2 towns over who does that kind of work. I thought it was a nice touch, something practical and warm at the same time. I got a haircut. I ironed a shirt I hadn't worn since Diane's funeral, the last time I'd bothered to iron anything at all. But the morning of the party was bright and warm, one of those early June days that makes you forget winter ever existed. I drove the hour and 10 minutes out to their neighborhood, windows cracked, the radio playing something soft. My hands were steady on the wheel, but there was a nervous flutter in my chest. I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was just excitement. Looking back now, I think some part of me already knew. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a two-story colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch. There were balloons tied to the mailbox, white and gold, and cars already lined up along the curb. I found a spot 2 houses down and parked. I sat there for a moment with the plaque in my lap, running my thumb over the painted numbers, and then I got out and walked up. I could hear voices before I reached the door, laughter drifting out through the open windows, the clink of glasses. I climbed the porch steps and reached for the door, and that's when I heard Constance's voice behind me, sharp and clipped. "Oh, Walter, we're actually doing photos out back right now. Would you mind heading around?" "Yeah." I turned. She was standing there in a cream-colored linen dress, her silver hair pinned up perfectly, holding a glass of white wine like she'd been standing on that porch her whole life. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," I said. "Happy housewarming, Constance. I brought something for the house." I held up the plaque. She glanced at it the way you'd glance at a coupon someone handed you on the street. "That's sweet. You can just leave it on the table by the door." She didn't take it from my hands. She just gestured, vaguely, toward a table crowded with other gifts and then turned and walked back inside, leaving me standing there holding a wrapped box no one wanted. I set it down myself and walked around the side of the house, my dress shoes crunching against the gravel path. The backyard opened up into a wide green lawn. String lights already hung between the trees for later that evening, a caterer's table loaded with little sandwiches and lemonade. Guests were mingling, people I recognized from the wedding years ago, a few new faces, co-workers of Thomas's maybe. And there, at the center of it all, under a wooden pergola draped in white fabric, stood Constance's family, arranged like they were posing for a magazine cover before the photographer had even arrived. Grace saw me and waved, relief crossing her face like she'd been looking for me. She hurried over and hugged me tight. "Dad, you made it. Isn't the house beautiful?" "It's beautiful, sweetheart. You did good." Thomas came over next, shook my hand, thanked me for coming, the way you thank an acquaintance for coming, not the way you thank the man who paid for your wedding and your down payment. There was something rehearsed in it. I told myself I was imagining things. The photographer arrived a few minutes later, a young woman with 2 cameras slung around her neck, and she clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, let's start with immediate family. Grandparents, parents, the kids, right here under the pergola." I stepped forward, the way anyone would, the way a grandfather naturally moves toward his grandchildren when their names are called into a photo. Caleb, 6 years old, was already tugging at my sleeve, asking if I'd brought him anything. I bent down to answer him, and that's when I felt a hand close around my arm, firm, guiding, not gentle at all beneath the smile that was aimed at everyone else. It was Constance. "Walter, we're just going to do a quick one with Richard and me and the kids first. Family tradition, you understand. It's just a few shots." And I looked at Grace. She was already turned away, adjusting Millie's little dress, not meeting my eyes. Thomas was staring at his shoes. "Thomas, Thomas, Thomas." "Of course," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Take your time." Constance didn't just step me out of the frame. She walked me, hand still on my arm, toward the side of the pergola, and positioned me behind one of the thick wooden posts, angled just enough that the photographer's lens wouldn't catch me at all. "We don't want it looking cluttered," she said, in that same syrupy tone. "Just a few minutes, Walter." I stood behind that post for what felt like 20 minutes but was probably closer to 15. I could see slivers of the scene through the gap in the wood. Constance holding Millie on her hip like she'd raised her herself. Richard's hand on Caleb's shoulder. Thomas smiling for the camera, a real smile, an easy one. Grace standing beside her husband, glancing occasionally toward the post where I stood, but never once saying my name, never once asking why I wasn't in the frame. I should have said something. I know that now. I should have stepped out from behind that post and said, plainly, that I was Grace's father, that I belonged in that photograph as much as anyone standing under that pergola. But something in me, some old habit built over 60 years of not wanting to be a burden, of not wanting to make a scene, kept my feet planted right where they'd been put. I told myself it was just a photo. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that afternoon that weren't true. When the photos finally finished, I stepped out from behind the post, and nobody remarked on it. Nobody apologized. The party simply moved on around me like water around a stone. I felt something cold settle into my chest, something I hadn't felt since the week after Diane's funeral, when the house had gone quiet and I'd sat alone at the kitchen table not knowing what to do with my hands. I wandered away from the crowd, toward the side yard where a small stone bench sat beneath a maple tree, half hidden from the party by a tall wooden fence. I needed a minute. I sat down, put my elbows on my knees, and just breathed. That's when I heard them. Voices, close by, on the other side of the fence, near what I guessed was the kitchen window left open for the breeze. Constance, Richard, and my daughter's husband, Thomas. He hovers, Constance was saying. Every time I turn around, he's right there, trying to insert himself. It's exhausting, honestly. Richard's voice, lower, agreeing. He needs to understand his role here. He's not the one raising these kids. Then Thomas spoke, and his words landed on me like stones. I know, he can be a lot, but he did help us with the down payment, so I feel like we owe him a little patience. Owed, Constance said, and I could hear the sneer in it even without seeing her face. He didn't owe you the down payment, Thomas. He gave it, Thomas. Don't let him turn a gift into a debt you have to keep paying off with his presence at every family event. Frankly, we've been more than generous letting him be as involved as he is. I sat frozen on that bench, my heart hammering so loud I thought they might hear it through the fence. Involved. As if my daughter's own children were a courtesy extended to me. As if the money that had put a roof over their heads was something to be resented rather than remembered. We should talk about maybe scaling back the visits, Constance continued. Every other month is plenty. The kids don't need 2 sets of grandparents pulling at them constantly. It's confusing for them. He's going to notice, Thomas said, and for a moment I thought, that's it, that's my son-in-law finally standing up. But then he continued, we should probably ease into it so it doesn't cause a scene. I don't know how long I sat there after their voices faded back into the house. Long enough for the cold feeling in my chest to burn itself into something else entirely. Something clearer. Something that didn't shake. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve to know it the way I eventually had to admit it to myself. When Grace and Thomas bought that house, I hadn't just wired them a gift. My lawyer, an old friend named Harold who'd handled Diane's estate, had insisted, gently but firmly, that if I was putting $15,000 toward a down payment, it needed to be documented properly, not as a casual family favor but as a real financial instrument in case anything ever happened, in case Grace and Thomas ever divorced, in case the money needed protecting. So we'd drawn up a private promissory note, secured against the property itself, filed quietly with the county. Thomas had signed it without much thought, eager to get the house closed. Grace didn't fully understand what it meant, and honestly, at the time, neither did I, not really. I just thought of it as paperwork. A formality Harold wanted for my protection. Sitting on that bench, I remembered it, and for the first time, I understood exactly what it meant. I got up, I smoothed my shirt. I walked back around to the front of the house instead of returning to the backyard, because I needed air that didn't smell like caterers' trays and cut flowers. On the front porch, I found a small cluster of guests I didn't recognize, and standing among them was a heavy-set older man with a friendly, weathered face, a drink in his hand, admiring the wraparound porch railing. Beautiful craftsmanship on this place, he said to no one in particular, then noticed me. You must be family. I'm Ed. I did the closing paperwork for these two. Title company. He extended a hand. Walter, I said. I'm Grace's father. His face brightened with recognition. Oh, you're the one who helped with the down payment. I remember that file. That's not something you see every day, a note like that filed against a personal residence. Real generous of you, and smart too, having your lawyer set it up that way. Protects everybody. A woman standing near him, someone I didn't know, turned with interest. Wait, what do you mean, a note against the house? Ed, having no idea he'd said anything out of turn, kept talking, the way people do when they think they're just making pleasant conversation. Mr. Walter here has a lien on the property, essentially. Perfectly normal. Family does it all the time to protect their investment. means the house can't really change hands or refinance without him signing off. I saw movement at the edge of the porch. Constance had come around from the backyard, drawn by the sound of voices, and she'd caught the tail end of what Ed said. Her face went the color of the linen dress she was wearing. "That's not something we need to discuss out here," she said, stepping forward with a tight smile aimed at the guests, though her eyes were locked on me. "Why not?" I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Ed's not saying anything untrue." Grace appeared behind her mother-in-law, drawn by the commotion, Thomas trailing a step behind her, his face pale. End quote. "Dad, what's going on?" I looked at my daughter, and for a moment all I saw was the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder in the truck on the way home from the hardware store. But I wasn't going to let that softness stop me anymore. Not after what I'd heard through that fence. I was just having a conversation with Ed here, about how generous it was of me to help you and Thomas buy this house, I said, and how your mother-in-law and I apparently disagree about whether that generosity earned me a place in this family, or just a place behind a wooden post. A few guests near the porch had gone quiet, sensing something was happening. Constance's jaw tightened. "Walter, this is neither the time nor the place." "I agree," I said. "It wasn't the time or the place 15 minutes ago either, when you had your hand on my arm walking me out of a family photograph like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto the lawn. But here we are." Grace's face crumpled with confusion, then something harder as understanding started to dawn. "Mom, I mean, Constance, is that true? You moved him out of the photo?" Constance didn't answer right away, and that silence answered for her. I turned to Thomas. "I heard you too, by the way. Through the kitchen window. You and your parents. Discussing how to scale back my visits. With my own grandchildren. Discussing whether my help with your down payment was a gift or a debt you resented paying off." Thomas's face went white as paper. "Dad, I mean, Walter, I can explain." "You don't need to explain," I said. "I heard the explanation already. From your own mouth." Eh. The porch had gone almost completely silent now, guests drifting closer despite themselves, the way people do when they sense something true is finally being said out loud after a long time of pretending otherwise. "I'm not interested in making a scene at my daughter's housewarming," I said, quieter now, though every word still carried. "I came here today with a gift and an open heart, same as I've come to every gathering this family has had for the last 5 years. I have never once asked for a thank you. I have never once brought up the money I've given, not at the wedding, not for this house, not ever, because I never wanted my daughter or my grandchildren to feel like my love came with a price tag." I looked at Constance. "But I will not stand behind a post at my own grandchildren's family photo while you decide how much room there is for me in their lives." Grace stepped toward me, tears already gathering. "Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." End quote. "I believe you," I said, "and I meant it. But not knowing doesn't undo it, sweetheart. It just means it's time we all start paying attention." I turned to Thomas one last time before I left. "You and I need to talk, privately. Not today. Call me this week. 10 a.m. I walked down the porch steps, past the balloons on the mailbox, and got into my car. I didn't look back at the house. I drove home with the windows down the whole way, the June air rushing past me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt, for better or worse, seen. The calls started that same evening. Grace first, crying, apologizing for something she still didn't fully understand yet. Then Thomas, stammering, asking if we could meet for coffee. I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of cruelty. I just needed a night to sit with what I'd learned about the people my daughter had built her life around. The next morning, I called Harold. I told him everything, the housewarming, the photograph, the conversation through the fence. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't want to punish my daughter. I never wanted that, not for 1 second. But I also wasn't going to keep pretending that Constance's contempt was something I had imagined, or that Thomas's willingness to go along with scaling back my time with Caleb and Millie was something I could simply forgive with silence. Harold reminded me, gently, that the note I held against the house meant Thomas and Grace couldn't refinance or sell without my signature. He asked if I wanted to use that as leverage. I told him I didn't want to take their house. I never wanted that either. What I wanted was something harder to put into legal language. I wanted to matter. I wanted my grandchildren to know their grandfather wasn't a courtesy, wasn't a line item, wasn't a man to be walked behind a post and forgotten. Thomas came to my house 3 days later, alone. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes, his hands shoved deep in his pockets like a boy waiting outside the principal's office. I let him in, made 2 cups of coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Grace used to do her homework. "I've been thinking about what you heard," he said. "I don't have a good excuse for it." "I'm not asking for an excuse," I said. "I'm asking whether you're going to keep letting your parents decide what my relationship with my grandchildren looks like." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his mug in slow circles on the table. "My mom's always been like that, controlling. I used to think it was because she loved us so much. Now I'm starting to wonder if it's because she needs to be the center of everything." He looked up at me. "That's not an excuse." "I know it's not. I let it happen because it was easier than fighting her. Easier than fighting for you, I guess. Which is a pretty ugly thing to admit." "It is," I agreed. "But at least you're admitting it." We sat with that for a while, the coffee going lukewarm between us. I told him about the note Harold had drawn up, the one filed against the house. Nah. I told him I had no intention of ever calling it in, of ever using it to hurt Grace or the kids or even him, so long as things changed. But I told him plainly that the days of being walked behind a post were over, whether that meant behind a literal wooden pillar at a photograph, or behind his mother's opinions in every decision that touched my grandchildren's lives. "I want to be at birthdays," I said. "I want to be at school plays. I want Caleb and Millie to know my name means something in this family, not just my checkbook." Thomas nodded, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he looked me in the eye instead of at the table. "You will be. I promise you that. I'd like to tell you that one conversation fixed everything, but life doesn't work that cleanly, and I think by now you know that as well as I do." Constance did not take the confrontation on the porch gracefully. Grace told me later that her mother-in-law spent a solid month insisting the whole thing had been blown out of proportion, that I was being dramatic, that families just have complicated dynamics and I ought to let it go. But something had shifted in Thomas that day, some backbone he'd been missing finally settling into place. He started standing up to his mother in small ways at first, then larger ones. He told her, in front of Grace, that I would be included in every family photograph from that point forward, full stop, no exceptions, no side conversations about scaling anything back. Constance and I have never become close. I don't imagine we ever will, and honestly, I've made my peace with that. Some people you don't need to win over. You just need them to stop standing in your way. But I see my grandchildren every other week now, sometimes more. Caleb calls me on the phone just to tell me about a spelling test he aced. Millie drew me a picture of our whole family last month, and she put me right in the middle of it, standing between her and Grace, holding both their hands. She didn't know anything about what happened at that party. She just drew the family the way she sees it, which, it turns out, was the way it should have been all along. Grace and I talk more openly now than we have in years. She apologized to me more times than I could count in that first month, and each time I told her the same thing. She didn't put me behind that post. She didn't have that conversation through the kitchen window. She just married into a family that hadn't yet learned to value what quiet sacrifice looks like. And it took a photograph and a stranger named Ed who talked a little too freely on a porch to finally bring it into the light. I never used the note against that house. I want to be clear about that, because I know some people might expect this story to end with me taking it all away, teaching them all a lesson through loss the way these stories sometimes go. That was never what I wanted. I didn't give my daughter and her husband a down payment so that one day I could take their home. I gave it because that's what a father does for his child, freely, without strings, or so I believed at the time. What Harold's paperwork gave me wasn't a weapon. It was proof. Proof that I mattered, on paper if nowhere else, until the day I finally stood on that porch and made sure I mattered everywhere else too. Last month, Grace called to tell me they're hosting Millie's birthday party at the house. The same backyard with the same pergola. She asked if I'd come early to help set up the decorations. The way I used to help set up the store window displays every holiday season back when Diane was still with us. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. When I hung up the phone, I sat for a moment in my quiet kitchen, and I thought about that day on the porch, the way my voice had shaken and then steadied, the way 15 years of swallowing my pride had finally reached its limit under a string of white lights and a wooden pergola. I thought about how close I'd come to just walking away quietly that day, the way I'd walked away quietly from so many small slights before it. I've learned something in the years since Diane passed, something I wish I'd understood sooner. Love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's just permission for people to forget you're standing there. You can give everything you have to the people you love, your money, your time, your whole broken and mending heart, and none of it guarantees you a seat at the table. Sometimes you have to step out from behind the post yourself and say, plainly, that you belong in the picture too. I'll be at that birthday party this weekend, right in the middle of every photograph, exactly where I belong, not because anyone granted me permission to stand there, but because I finally stopped waiting for it,